Hello and welcome, YBS viewers. Today on Channel 7 News, squirrels and other furry critters are becoming roadkill at alarming rates. Later, we discuss possible solutions to this growing problem. Also, Y2K is approaching. Find out what you can do to be prepared. But now, we have the afternoon convo in America. I'm Reginald Langdon. And today our conversation discusses a very poignant issue, guns in school. Are your children safe, and are the laws that we have in place sufficient to protect them? Today, being the 20th of August, is the 4-month anniversary of the Columbine tragedy in Colorado, where 12 students and 1 teacher lost their lives. In response to a growing number of tragedies such as this, the Supreme Court has reassessed the federal government's role in passing laws surrounding guns in schools. This past week, they upheld the constitutionality of the Guns-Free School Zone Act. But to further discuss the meanings and implication of these issues, we have 2 experts with us here today. First, we have Kevin Ackerman, attorney of the California Board of Education and graduate of UC Berkeley. And secondly, we have Gene Hancock, former Seattle police officer and public relations official of the American Guns Association. All right, so Gene, as I understand it, this recent federal court case, United States v. Danks, took a fresh look at whether the Gun-Free School Zone Act was constitutional when they inserted the phrase, any guns that would affect interstate commerce. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, in order to understand this case that just finished, we have to go back to the 1990 law as was written and then examine what happened since then. So the 1990 law, when it was first enacted in response to the violence that we were seeing, they put in the law that the federal government could now charge people for having guns in schools. Now, they were kind of vague on the jurisdiction of when they could actually do that. So in 1995, there was a court case, which was the United States versus Lopez, in which the Supreme Court actually found that as it was written, the law did not give the federal government jurisdiction under the Commerce Clause. In 1996, they went back and they fixed that by adding that phrase. Now this new case, United States v. Danks that just ended, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals actually held up this new phrase as being constitutional. Now, we could argue about whether or not that's a good thing or not. The United States versus Lopez actually did a lot to curb the power of the federal government, which was intruding on our lives. But so it's still kind of one of those things that you have to be looking at carefully.
And that's interesting that you bring it up, that the act was intruding in on our lives, because I really feel like it was the other way. I feel like the Constitution, the law was set in place to kind of protect the privacy of our lives and also protect kind of the privileges that we have under the rights of the Constitution. Now, there is a question of limiting the power of the federal government. However, what we need to do is really have in check and really instigate and investigate these state powers and how they can manipulate or maybe take out of context some of the laws that are implied, especially in terms of guns, that are implied in the Constitution itself. So I felt that Lopez and versus the United States in 95 did an effective job in stating concisely what is or is not constitutional in the regards of bringing guns into school zones.
Well, I just want to add here really quickly, I think that fixing it was sort of unnecessary because in 1994 they passed the Gun-Free School Act, which is different than the Gun-Free School Zone Act because this put the onus on the school districts themselves. Now, every state has to basically implement their own laws as to guns on school campuses. And most states, as of this moment, within the state now classify that as a gross misdemeanor, which is a felony.
I guess to build off what you are saying, this clause stipulates that firearms and guns have to affect interstate commerce?
A couple of factors go into consideration of economical factors of how the interstate commerce clause can be used to extend the power of the Constitution. And one of those is that for guns, I mean, violent crime causes harm, and harm can be expensive. I mean, harm and guns are an expense, and in turn that will raise social costs of living, such as insurance costs. And these insurance costs will then be embedded throughout the economy and local community as well, making living in that community itself more expensive, and the connotations behind that community being a place of gun ownership or a higher propensity of gun ownership can be a little deplorable.
I'm actually going to have to disagree with my colleague here on this one. He's giving the government too much credit. When they were enacting these laws, they weren't considering the student safety. They were only trying to find a loophole in which they could enact their laws. So whether or not they're actually thinking of the student safety and thinking about them as a commerce or their well-being being good for commerce, I think that actually came after when they finally found a way to close the loophole, and now they're trying to find a way to justify closing that loophole.
Well, as a slight rebuttal here, I think that just knowing the fact that a gun could be in the classroom would inhibit students' learning. I know for me personally, if I knew that my teacher was wielding, or if I had a classmate right next to me, then we're taking a test and he could maybe pull out a gun and give you the answers. I mean, that's pretty far-fetched and hypothetical, but in the same sense, there still is that incessant fear that's going on for each and every student.
I guess the question would follow then. What are your thoughts, Kevin, on schools being a place of interstate commerce and students being economic resources?
And that's a really good question, Mr. Langdon. And there's a multitude of things that we must consider, really. And the first one is that our education is a indicator of the nation's financial health. And essentially, the less education, less learning that we have for our youth, the weaker our national economic state is. And another important aspect in terms of economic conditions is for a certain area that does have a lot of guns, is that a very marketable area for a business to start their new operations? Probably not. And so when we consider that, it also puts our students in that local area in a disposition, because now they can't get a job that a business would maybe build at that area. Go ahead.
Well, I think, again, this is after the courts have already made their decision on the constitutionality of this law. So now after this law is written and after the courts have ruled on it, now they have to justify the ruling for it and why this law is constitutional. And so they're doing it under the Commerce Clause. And I really actually feel it's kind of sad that we're now viewing students and people as commodities when it's complicated. It's a much more complicated issue than that.
And that's what the global marketplace dictates, is to look at youth and look at these individuals as commodities, as resources. And that's because we're in a constant flux of competition. We're always trying to compare one individual, one business to another, or maybe one prospective interviewee to another. And I think that's really a natural process of our national and global economy.
So it seems to me, as someone who's still trying to get a grasp on this issue, that if we were to start viewing students and their academic performance as an economic resource, as you say, Kevin, that could easily become a slippery slope argument to justify a lot of other issues in schools. What do you have to say about this, Kevin?
Well, there are a few other things that can be applied to this situation. And by things, I mean possibly alcohol, drugs like marijuana, or another thing that's very prevalent nowadays that we see the removal of is asbestos. Now, all these three things have in common is that they inhibit student learning in one way or another. Now, that can be from the natural effects of, alcohol, or it can be placed on what happens through the economical factors through these things that are prevalent in these areas where the students are learning.
I think this kind of creates sort of a dangerous precedence for other issues involved in education. For example, next thing you know, they're going to be changing the way we have our playgrounds because it's affecting the economic situation, or other issues like that. The types of things that we teach in our schools, like in science or literature, what books we're allowed to read, what books we aren't allowed to read, because it affects the commercial thing. And he mentioned alcohol. Remember the last time the federal government got involved in alcohol prohibition? How well did that turn out? Not very well.
Yeah, the federal government definitely seemed to backpedal on that one.
Well, I really think that, I see what you're saying with the playground setting here, playground rules, but we have to have determinant factors. We have to have aggravating factors for us to really push us in a way that we have to extend legislation or extend federal power or state power in creating their own statutory law.
So, Gene, you expressed your opinion that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun would be to have a good guy with a gun. There are schools that allow security officers to carry firearms. There's a risk with this, though, that the students in the school would feel uneasy having guns there and may compromise their education. What is your response to this?
Well, actually, there's actually other problems with having armed guards or police officers in a school. They do that because since no one else can carry and it's a vulnerable population, you have to put something there. The problem is they can only afford to have one or two officers at the school at a time. So if someone comes in to shoot up the school, the first person they're going to take out is the police officer or the security guard, leaving everyone else vulnerable if there's only just one of them.
No, I just think that security guards in their merit or their original creations are intended to, protect the school and protect the students. I totally agree with that. But in the same stance, we're putting more guns. We're answering some guns with more guns. And to me, that just doesn't seem like the most viable and logical solution. There's definitely things that if we do our due diligence and research about, maybe we can explore other options here. Maybe metal detectors, or maybe we can, there's just, and brass tacks here is that there's other options available if we do enough research, not just less guns equals more guns argument.
Well, a sign above a door isn't some magic force field that keeps out criminals with guns. So like he mentioned, metal detectors. Now, having to go through a metal detector every day as you enter your school, I think that's going to affect students as well, having that mental image of, well, there's a metal detector here, that means this place probably isn't safe. So it's going to be doing the exact same thing that you're trying to stop.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny you mention that because I feel like in airports, I don't get that sense of feeling. I feel like, they're just taking the necessary precautions to ensure my safety through the flight. And that's not because there's going to be, guns prevalent, or it's not because I'm entering a rather dangerous environment. It's just because there's certain precautions that need to be put in place.
Well, in airplanes, you actually have armed marshals who are concealed carrying and you don't know who they are. So they won't be a target right away, whereas if you have a marked police officer or security guard with a gun, it's different than having someone who's concealing.
Okay.
What about teachers then? If the teachers were to carry guns and no one were to know about them, it would avert that fear, would it not?
And I think you're right. I think in some sense it would avert that fear for the students, but then we got to also take in respect of how the teacher teaches. They're the ones knowing that they have the gun. Now, will that affect the way they present their learning in all their curriculum? It really depends.
Well, yeah, if you're going to have teachers concealed carrying on school grounds, it's going to have to be a very specific program because just being able to have a gun doesn't necessarily make you qualified to carry in a situation like in a school. And actually, to your point of will it change how the teacher teaches, well, it should. Because when you're carrying a gun, it makes you, every situation can be escalated. So you have to be really careful about which situations you want to escalate and which situations you have to simply walk away from because the consequences are so much more real.
So having guns in school, period, is contentious. What are some alternative options that are being considered to combat and prevent school shootings and the danger that they impose.
Some alternative options that we can take to the metal detectors is maybe adding some maybe extra classes for students that have maybe identified or voluntarily admit themselves into and having maybe external problems or maybe internal problems with the school as well. So those are always a simple kind of option that we would like to explore more.
Yeah, recently it seems with these recent tragedies, like in Columbine, these were young men who had problems for a long time. The school, I think, in some ways failed them. I think some society sort of failed them in a way. We should be able to recognize that something was wrong and address that need, first of all. Secondly, when the tragedy took place, no one was prepared for it. We prepare for floods, we prepare for earthquakes, but when the shooter entered, no one knew what they were doing. Some people hid, people were clumped together, which made them easier targets. So I think we really need to address how we treat these situations in schools because it is becoming a growing problem. So we need to be able to address how to deal with this when it happens.
I mean, externally, if we look at it, states have different gun laws. I mean, and it allots for a higher propensity for guns being in a certain place of public education or public commerce. And so what we need to do is identify states that have leisure gun laws and maybe have them take more accountability. I mean, if we can add some way of adding legislation to southern states like Texas, to add more legislation for gun accountability and gun ownership, maybe we can start to curb and see a difference in school shootings.
So I definitely like what both of you are saying about alternative options. This is a discussion that we as Americans need to be having. And some of those options may involve looking at legislature surrounding gun manufacturing and buying and selling and possibly placing restrictions on those practices. However, from my perspective, this runs a risk of infringing on Americans' Second Amendment rights. But I would like to get your perspective. How might these new laws surrounding guns in schools affect American Second Amendment right to bear arms?
Well, the reason we have the Second Amendment rights is sort of twofold. One is to protect ourselves from an oppressive government. That was clearly one of the main reasons that they enacted that law at the time when they were facing an oppressive government of the Crown of England. But also sort of a secondary reason is so that we can protect ourselves. Like I said earlier, sometimes these things happen in a matter of seconds, but law enforcement is 20 minutes away, 15 minutes away. Something has to be done immediately, and without having the right to protect ourselves, where are we going to be? And I am afraid that if we pass more of these oppressive laws, that takes away the ability for responsible citizens, law-abiding citizens, and keeps guns out of their hands. Criminals aren't going to follow those laws anyway, so then only the criminals are going to be having firearms.
It is imperative that we protect our vested rights as individuals against external parties and forces and entities that may be manipulative. And we may exercise those rights through guns, although that's not ideal. However, what we must be cautious of is the variance between the Second Amendment and how the states interpret those laws. What we have to do is keep the states in check. And whether we do that through a federal mandate or what have you, we just need to make sure that we keep variance in check.
So I really want to thank you guys for being here today on the Afternoon Convo in America. I definitely feel like I'm starting to get a little bit of a better understanding on these issues. It's definitely a complicated issue, and for my view, it's not clear on who should be making these decisions. You had a lot of helpful insight, though. I hope that our audience can agree as well. But in the spirit of keeping this conversation going and including everyone's opinions, I would like to extend this conversation to some of our live audience members. Are there any questions or concerns that you have for concerning guns in school, and hopefully we can enlist the help of our guests as well.